All right, so for this lecture, we're looking at women and art in the Middle Ages, specifically looking kind of at embroidery and its influence, and then briefly at women and Islamic art in the Middle Ages. So we have the topics here for you that you can look up yourself. We're going to start with embroidery and kind of the background to that. So embroidery was an important decorative element in the medieval period, and it was not only beautiful but super prized decorative aspect that definitely has a link to like illuminated manuscripts and tapestries, both in kind of the themes and motifs that it used. So when we looked at illuminated manuscripts, you had a lot of course, religious iconography and, of course, embroidery, what has survived. So that's something to point out. There is a difference between what was actually created and what has survived that we can examine and know about today. It's not surprising that the religious embroidery has survived more than secular embroidery. And ultimately, because anything that was just used in daily items and worn with fabric is going to deteriorate, is going to get worn out, is going to get thrown away, where the religious embroidery was put into churches and housed and held onto longer and preserved better. So we end up having more of that anyway. But it was a massive industry that was both seen as a major art form and just an aspect of objects that you wanted around your house for decoration. And then, of course, the specific religious decoration as well. And it was expensive, so much like illuminated manuscripts. Wealthy individuals, churches, royalty, nobility, they were the ones that largely could afford to purchase these items for their homes over the average person during this period in time. To be clear with the definition of embroidery, because there is often a confusion between embroidery and tapestry, right? So this is a tapestry here. This is embroidery. And and we'll see this in the Bayeux tapestry is one of the most famous embroidered uh, um, objects, but it's called a tapestry, but it's not a tapestry. So even in the most famous example of embroidery from the time period, the name became the Bayeux tapestry, but it isn't a tapestry. So embroidery is the art of applying decoration by needle and thread to the surface of a piece of woven cloth, usually called the ground. It is an optional decoration worked after the whole weaving process, including the dyeing and finishing, has been completed. So the idea is right, that here it's the decoration by needle and thread and finished after as the final thing. Essentially, once you're not weaving any of the cloth anymore, there's dyeing has been completed. When all of that's done, then the embroidered aspect done by needle is added onto it. Where tapestry is the difference with tapestry is essentially a complex or figured weave, and that is different. So with tapestry, you can see here the design. This is woven into the fabric with the thread, right? It's the woven designs. Embroidered, and it's, if you look here, well, again, there's similarities. This is done after the fact with a needle and thread into the linen, versus the image being woven in when you're working on it with the cloth itself. So the fabric has to have already been removed from the loom on which it's been woven before it can be given to the embroiderer to add the extra decoration. This originally, when it was done, and throughout history, can be simple design and for everyone. The relatively simple edition But of course, over time into the Middle Ages, this embroidery became very elaborate, which is what made it very expensive and connected it to the illuminated manuscripts. So there definitely was embroidery before the Middle Ages, and it was cheaper embroidery that was done that was not elaborate and was pretty simplistic. That's usually not seen in the same level of art form, though, as this period in the Middle Ages with this kind of very elaborate and detailed embroidery. Embroidered wall hangings and furniture covers were definitely reached the peak of popularity before the 12th century, and then become less common as the large, finely woven, figured like people on storytelling tapestries became not only a major artistic creation, but import business in parts of France and Italy. So what's interesting is that both of these things kind of, embroidery becomes a big thing for a while, and then tapestries take over. And they were, again, I think one of the things that indicates to this idea that it was seen as an art form is, especially when it, for both embroidery, but even I think even more so the tapestries, that these were hung on walls with these larger pieces. Obviously, there were smaller personal pieces that were made too, but the larger pieces were intentionally made to be a form of art, to be hung on walls. Not just simply a blanket or a piece of clothing or a book cover, but those existed as well in the process. So you really kind of have two things: the larger art pieces, and then the smaller, more personal objects that took place. And this the tapestries had, like I said, spread widely around the late 13th century and continued popularity through the 18th century. So the tapestries kind of took over from the embroidery. And then embroidery, though, was still used in kind of more personal objects rather than the larger artistic ones. Obviously, as I mentioned, the Bayeux tapestry was the most popular. But of course, the name is somewhat part of that confusion between tapestry and embroidery, because it's actually embroidered wool on linen. And the name being wrong is part of that people not always knowing the difference between the two in that. But this art form was significant in that it was often done by women in convents, and then also moved to actually outside of convents into kind of a whole business structure, both within the home and family units to larger associations. So you had, and in all of these cases, you had women who were largely the ones doing the intricate embroidery. Now, for the larger design, because if you had something smaller like this, right? This might have all been designed if this was the whole entirety of the piece, right? Then this would probably just be designed by the person who embroidered it. But when you have a really large piece that's being done, whether that was for religious garb or for a larger hanging piece on the wall, there was usually someone that designed it, that set up and sketched out the whole design, and then this often would be sketched onto the linen, that then the embroiderers could follow the pattern. So essentially providing a pattern. This was sometimes done by women, but that tended to be done by men more often than women. And then women were the ones that actually did the embroidery. You also have women patrons who commissioned and shaped and guided the type of work that they wanted. So women who, like with the illuminated manuscripts, may not have been the ones actually creating it, but were the ones dictating what they wanted it to be of and how they wanted it to look, and then you get the final kind of product. So women were intricately involved within embroidery, and kind of all of the different stages. That's not counting depending on, location and size with the loom and creating the linen itself and the spinning the thread. Those had in the past traditionally been roles of women that did that type of work. Although as this moved into a larger business industry, they had full-on guilds and workshops that produced this. However, even within that case, we'll look at that there were some women guilds that were entirely for the whole process of the embroidery, which was unusual because largely women were excluded from guilds. So to have guilds that actually were only for women was significant in showing the role that women played within creating these artworks and the being a part of the whole process. So one of the earliest, just like with illuminated manuscripts, were in convents, nuns taking part in the creation of this artwork. Again, they weren't the first. The embroidery has long been part of, and textiles has been part of a casual pastime that it was a skill that women were taught and did within their home. And that took place before this became a serious occupation and organized domestic activity, right? And so you have, of course, the development of town guilds and economies that emerged from this. But also embroidery was also made in convents and homes of noblewomen, and then it expanded from there. So again, this isn't to say that this started with the convents. This is when you just have this large push of these larger textiles and things, that this is when this happened. So in convents, teams of women produced fine fabrics used for vestments, and as exports commodities to be sent to Byzantium in exchange for gold, which then helped actually support and produce further products for the convent. And they played a central role in creating and I'd say having the name go out there of the value and beauty of this type of artwork. Women's work produced one of the few marketable export items of the economy and provided important income, again, for these convents, because a lot of times they were kind of expected to, may have been given modest funds, but if they wanted to do anything else, they had to support themselves. And so this was a way to be able to do it. The common creation in the convents were these elaborate embroideries that were used for the priest's vestments, or as an offering to a saint. And it's not surprising that, the convents produced more of the religious vestments. But again, this is based still on the fact that this is what survived, and that they probably also were participating in producing other types of smaller embroidery that they could sell. So here we have examples of like a religious, oops, let me write that properly here. Religious garment that the priest would put over them and stuff, that has, and it's hard to see here, but you have the top part here that was broken into these sections, and then usually within the main part of the body, then it told a story, the various religious stories, usually with Jesus, that then the priest would wear or that they would hang and display. You also had these elaborate ones that were hung up that would have different aspects of displaying, like saints or important people figures or religious figures' lives. And in each of the sections, right, this one's broken into 8 sections here, would give a history or part of their story that then can be visually displayed for people to see and really get the whole story of their life. These were done to honor saints, to honor religious figures in the various biblical stories and things like that. And these, like I said, were planned out and took a whole kind of group to work to plan how this was going to be done, because this is completely covered. This top one here is completely covered in embroidery. So the amount of time that would take to do the entirety of this and each of these sections, with the borders and then with the people and all of the intricate design, was significant, and makes the convents an initial place to do this elaborate embroidery. Again, if you're doing something simple, that's a small little image, that doesn't take as much time. But if you're doing these elaborate, large, massively large pieces, then convents were the perfect place to really have a start in this for women, because this is one of the things that they had plenty of time and not other obligations to work on and produce this, much like with the illuminated manuscript. So again, that parallel of how those worked is very similar in that sense with that. These were frequently done intricate beyond just the imagery, but embroidered with pearls, jewels, gold, and silver thread for the priest and saints. So, depending on, especially for religious embroidery, they tended to use expensive thread. This is also why these were largely regulated to the upper classes, the church, and royalty, because when they did these elaborate pieces, they used very expensive items to decorate it. You also had one of the earliest is an abbess that lived in the 7th century, and she offered to Saint Cuthbert a stole and maniple, it was called fine and magnificent embroidery of gold and precious stones, worked, it is said, with her own hands, for she was a skilled craftswoman in gold embroidery. And that was a quote that was written about her just a little bit later during the contemporary time period. So you have, even in the 7th century, like specific women being recognized for their skill in embroidery. And like those, like in the ones that we know of women specifically, largely came from the convents initially. Embroidery could also be used to promote their religious institutions, right, in order to gain more funding and support. This was often achieved through the religious iconography. When you had pilgrims that would go visit the different convents and churches, if there was a piece of embroidery and art that was hung up, or a religious piece that became well known, you had pilgrims that would go to that church, so would travel specifically to view the artwork. Just like, so the pilgrimages like became very popular for a time, and people would travel to different churches that had relics from bones, pieces of cloth from various saints and martyrs and things like that. But besides the relics, this was the other component that like I would actually put your convent or church on the map for pilgrims to travel to. And of course, once they would visit, they would often provide donations. More people would attend. So it was a significant support of not just the convent, but the church that it was largely attached to. This one here is showing the life of Saint Elizabeth, and her, we'll say her acts, her religious acts, like her, like feeding the poor, taking care of the sick, the different types of religious things that kind of got her the title of Saint Elizabeth. And while it's faded now, right, you have each of these sections is highlighting those different ways that she provided those works and acts of service in her lifetime. You also have, this is an example. So what we've been seeing here has largely been like in color, obviously with different types of threads used for the embroidery, but there was another style that was popular as well, which was called white work. And white work was done, obviously it's all white, and it was essentially that they would use, they would bleach the thread and everything so that it was all done in white, and was very distinctive because of that. You essentially, you had the white, which was use white or colored silk thread, but either way, you ultimately, if you use colored silk thread, you used a very light colored silk thread, and then it was on bleached linen. So it was either white on white or white with light colors, with not a lot of color to it, and then bleached linen, or even thread sometimes, so that it was all white on white. This one here is an example of one that was embroidered and done for Saint Elizabeth's life, but specifically Gertrude. Gertrude was the daughter of Elizabeth, and her mother ends up dying when she's really young, and she's placed in the convent, and she ends up becoming a magistra and plays a huge important role in the production of art in churches. And she uses her position as magistra to Altenburg convent to be a patron of this iconographic embroidered works. Specifically, she did a couple to her mom. This one, though, with the white work, was done to display her life from her mother's life, from noblewoman to essentially saint, through kind of, I guess, her eyes and stuff. It was called Gertrude's Mother. And it showed that actually how powerful she was, that she was able to use her leadership role to commission and display the embroidered piece in the convent, in actually a very prominent spot. So she not only was very powerful within the convent, had the money and resources to be able to commission this piece, but then also used it with what was seen as a traditional acceptable form, because they already had one. I showed it here, that this is the same Elizabeth of this one was for Saint Elizabeth's, like, acts as a saint and stuff. But what was interesting with this one is that this was essentially almost like an homage to her mother, both in showing her first as a noble woman, and then and having Gertrude, and then our transformation to a saint before her death. And so with this one, it was we know that she wasn't directly involved in all of the embroidery herself, but that we know for sure she oversaw the work. And there's debate over whether she helped with the embroidery or just simply oversaw the work. But we know that she also did embroidery herself. So this one's unclear, because it talks more about her being a patron of it. And usually patrons like commissioned it and then dictated what they wanted it to look like, but didn't necessarily do all the embroidery. But at the same time, we know that she also did embroidery herself. So she could have helped with this, or she could have just taken the patron's role with this. Either way, she was the one that commissioned this work, and then because of her position was able to have it displayed. The embroidery shows 8 key scenes from Elizabeth's life, split between noble and religious phases, as was mentioned, and kind of as key moments of Elizabeth's life through her daughter Gertrude's eyes. And the top row represents Elizabeth's life as a noblewoman, and the bottom row is her time spent dedicated to God. All of the scenes are super personal in nature, and would have held a significance to Elizabeth and Gertrude, such as, like, there was one of the scenes shows the departure of her father to the Fifth Crusade, which would eventually lead to his death. So the fact that Gertrude was able to invest so much time and money into creating such a personal tribute to her mother, and then display it in the convent along with the depictions of her family, shows the power she held in the convent. Although, again, her mother was Saint Elizabeth, so that probably helped too. If her mom was just someone that was not connected to the church, who knows if she would have been able to display it. I could not find an image that showed the whole thing front and center. This is the only image. So you get some random people in this picture, and unfortunately you only get to see the work from a side angle. I spent quite a bit of time trying to find a picture that showed the thing from the front, and I could not find it. So there was the close-up scene here, and then this one shows the piece, but it's from kind of a weird angle and it's of people viewing it. But it does give you an idea of what the white work looked like, along with the piece where you can see the sections. And again, you have the top row and then you have the bottom row. So the top row was pre-religious scenes, and then the religious scenes and stuff like that. This was again, any of these are, it's amazing that any of these actually survived, because this picture is actually taken from an article that was talking about how these were brought back to Altenburg, and that they were celebrating the fact that these had survived and been kind of restored and put up, because so many of these things got stored or moved over time. So the ability to actually have these back on display today is a big deal, because, and the fact that any of these actually survive. There are some that are in very fragile condition. You obviously see the one that we looked at earlier of her religious acts, St. Elizabeth's religious acts, that was pretty faded. But that, I think that highlights again the fact that we have any of these that still exist is significant, because they are fragile, and they often were, displayed in the convents and the churches, and then after so many years they were taken down and stored and moved around. And when we talk about the Bayeux Tapestry, that one's crazy how it survived in that. So that's what it looks like from the kind of an angle of the whole, even though I don't have a picture of the whole thing front and center, unfortunately. But so we end up with, like I said, with this work all of these highlight that female patronage, craftsmanship, and religious devotion centered on women's experiences. And I think that's significant when you look at the fact that in a lot of art, even if women were the producers of it, they weren't necessarily always the main subject of the artwork. And in this case, every aspect of this artwork, of the Gertrude's Mother, the embroidery of Gertrude's Mother, was centered around women. As a patron, the craftsmanship in the convent, the center focus on her transformation in her and her family, and then the transformation and religious devotion. Every single stage of this artwork was connected to women and women artists in some way, and that is unusual in the Middle Ages in terms of artwork. Even if women were actively involved in the creation, they're not usually in the depiction of it, or if they're depicted, they're not the ones creating it. And here we have, I think, embroidery in general is where you have the most cases and examples of artwork that is fully centered around women in every stage of its creation, of the artwork that it's portraying. And you don't get that kind of level of examples in other kind of art forms. Of course, there were plenty of other art styles that were done with religious figures and stories that weren't of women, and yet were created by women as well. But just the fact that you have several examples where these were centered on highlighting women, made by women, paid by women to do, is a big deal in that sense. With this, you also have convents taught noble daughters embroidery skills. So they actually were a school that wasn't just a school of embroidery, but they were a school, and one of the things that they taught the daughters of nobility were embroidery skills, which allowed to preserve and promote the art form across generations, which was important. Even as some of the large-scale production died down, you still had noble women, that this was an important skill for women to learn and know how to do within the home, and kept it within, essentially centered as part of an art that women were the main producers of. The other aspect, of course, with this is that embroidery was seen as a status symbol because of there were definitely lower cost women that could embroider, but because a lot of it was so expensive, and this period highlighted the time and skill that upper class women were expected to learn how to do, it certainly was seen as a status symbol, especially if you could either create or commission a larger piece that was kind of designated within that art form. And noble women took pride in needlework and creating this elaborate clothing and church vestments that showcased their skill. An example of this is with a queen that embroidered the stole and maniple that we have here, that is actually preserved in Durham Cathedral, that highlights this embroidery and the skill to do so. So we have the two examples of this that was done. The queen that was the second wife of Edward the Elder, and she didn't just she wasn't just a patron of these. She actually embroidered and created these and then gave them to the church. And it was not only a way to show her skill, but it was also a way to show her like religious devotion as well, right? That this could be highlighted. And then especially if these were then used by the priest and displayed in the church, that gave a status symbol to that woman who either, and it didn't have to be embroidering it. If she commissioned it, or if she made it herself, if then those things were then displayed and used by the priest in the church, that conferred a type of a religious and social status onto that woman for her devotion, for her skill, for her ability to, gift this to the church. So it was often used in that way to curry favor, to show, in this case, if you have a queen that's gifting this, it also could be used for political favor, right? It's beneficial for the king to have a wife who then is seen positively in regard to religious structures and establishments, right? And if her work is being displayed for the general populace to see, right, that is a boon on the king and that connection. And so even the nobility and especially royalty could utilize this political component with their embroidery skills, and it was definitely something that was used on a regular basis. Now the Bayeux Tapestry, again, is probably the most famous tapestry. It's not a tapestry. The famous embroidery that is named a tapestry from this time period. And it was recognized not only as a piece of art, but also a historical source that describes the Norman conquest of England. Of course, one of the issues I mentioned is the fact that it's amazing when any of these survive over decades, because fabric erodes over time, and many embroidery pieces are passed down and moved around before being lost and destroyed. And the Bayeux Tapestry has a crazy story of survival. And the fact that this, survived over centuries, especially with everything that happened, is crazy with us. So how this came about with this is a massive, I'm going to show you how massive this thing is. So this is almost all of it. This is the length of this embroidery piece. It's huge. They believe that it was actually meant to be like on the castle hallway, which would make sense. Like, why else would you have something this long? It wouldn't fit into anyone's home. Maybe a church or convent's like walkway, but it potentially could fit into a castle hallway and stuff like that. This thing is insanely long. And even this picture, I tried to find the best one that highlighted just how long it is. If you go to like Wikipedia and look there, they have one that like has one that you can scroll through it, and that also gives you a sense of how long this thing is. So this is the largest a piece of embroidered fabric at this time or anywhere really. It's huge, and the amount of time that it would have taken to make this is massive. So it understandably has its right as the most well-known and famous embroidered artwork of its time. But so that just gives you, I just wanted to before we talk about the history of what happened with this gives you the sense of how big this piece is. Because when I just put the sections up in the PowerPoint, you're only getting the small little individual artistic pieces and not the entirety of how big this thing is. So This massive embroidery has somehow survived, initially unmentioned after it was created. It's just there. It's not mentioned in like historical documents or things for several centuries, and then continues to arouse no further interest until the early part of the 18th century. It's first mentioned. So when we first hear about it, we know it was created before that. It was created in the 11th century, but there's not record of it, and there's not talk, which again, how something this large doesn't have like a historical mention. You know, who knows how this was recorded or talked about when it was first created, but it was created in the 11th century, and then there's no mention of it until an inventory is taken of the belongings of the Cathedral of Bayeux in 1476. Right, so you have the inventory of the Cathedral of Bayeux in 1476, but we could put prior to that, right, 11th century it was created. So from its creation, there is no mention of it until the 1476. And it's just mentioned as an inventory, which means by that point, it had been placed in storage somewhere. It was no longer hanging up. And again, it probably didn't start in the cathedral. Because I think it probably would have been in a hallway of a palace. But at some point it made it to the cathedral, and by 1476 it's now in inventory. It's not hanging up, it's not displayed, it's just an inventory. And then there's no reference of why it got put into the cathedral. Most likely it was moved from the palace to the cathedral for safeguarding, with the recognition of how like amazing this piece was, and that it didn't want it to disappear or be destroyed. And so churches, convents, cathedrals were often the best place for storage and preservation of these things. But obviously they didn't really pay much attention to it and stuff like that. And then again, like I said, there's nothing until a part of the 18th century when the first drawings were made. So the 18th century, someone saw it, let's say drawings made, and decided that it was interesting enough or remarkable enough that they actually drew out all of them. So we have like drawings of it. You can just see the pictures of the drawings of the whole artwork as well, which is nice, because even if the benefit of that is that even if the piece itself gets destroyed, we still have a visual record of what it looks like. Now it's still nice to have the actual embroidery, but this gave it a secondary way of making sure that the record would remain of this piece. All right, and then these drawings were then published in a series of engravings around like 1729, 1730. So that actually made it more aware to larger number of people that this thing even existed. The tapestry was then lucky to survive the next 2 centuries, as it survived the French Revolution, right, which was tumultuous in terms of destruction of things. And more importantly, it survived the French Revolution with attempts to use it as a wagon cover. So there was an attempt to use it as a wagon cover at one point during the French Revolution, and then also as a part to cut it. They wanted to cut it up for a float and part of a carnival to the goddess of reason. Neither of these things ended up happening because local admirers recognized the value of it and held on to it. All right, so after being saved from the French Revolution's attempts, random people's attempts to cut it up and use it for, I mean, they probably just like, hey, this is a massive amount of fabric. Fabric's expensive. Let's repurpose it. But like I said, luckily local admirers were like, no, this is artworks. Don't do that. So they saved it. Then Napoleon, so not 3 again, 4. Napoleon saw it and he thought that it would be useful as essentially propaganda. And he transferred it to Paris to what he hoped would encourage enthusiasm for his invasion of England, but then ultimately returned it when the plan for that was abandoned. And then for a while, it was kept. I'm running out of space here. From there, it was kept at the prefecture at Bayeux, but it's more well known at this point. So that is helpful. So we'll put back here with this the Bayeux again. But well known at this point, so that by that point it has a much better chance of being preserved, because now, prior to like the French Revolution, where obviously people had no idea what it was, they just decided it was useful fabric, to now being seen as an important piece of artwork. From there, it was copied by Charles Todhard, who provided super accurate drawings for the Society of Antiquaries in London, which also shows that it now has massive recognition as an important piece of artwork in history. But then you have, I'll put it over, we'll go way over here. You have, of course, the Franco-Prussian War that it had to survive, and World War II with invasion by Germany. And the Germans were notorious for taking artwork that they wanted. So, but I skipped the Franco-Prussian War with that. So with the Franco-Prussian War, they removed it from Bayeux for protection. So they actually intentionally, they now know, having a much more knowledge of it, they moved it to a safe location during that war so that it didn't get destroyed. And then, during World War II, during German occupation of Paris, there was a couple unsuccessful attempts to remove it to Germany from the Louvre, but it was not successful. And then in 1945, the tapestry was returned to Bayeux and exhibited in the old Bishop's Palace. In 1982, it was cleaned, rebacked, and rehung in its own museum. So finally, we can put... ended up, oh, I have that one. We'll just circle that one here. Right. It is now, it has its own dedicated museum after restoration. So that, the journey of this tapestry, and think about it, though, this one was hard to ignore. You saw how massive this thing was. So this was much harder to ignore. Smaller pieces would much more easily get discarded and you know, lost, and people just, you know, didn't think anything about, oh, there's this smaller piece of fabric, I'm just going to repurpose it for this because who cares, right? But this one at least stood out more because of how massive it was. It definitely had, even if people weren't aware of its significance, there was recognition of the quality of art that it was, to kind of try to protect it, even when it wasn't famous, if you will. But that's the journey of the Bayeux Tapestry, which I think is crazy important to know. Just again, how even this massive piece, how much effort had to go in, and luck had to go into saving it. And the fact that we even have it today is, you know, a minor miracle, because of just the all the different things that potentially could have happened to it. And that's this massive piece here, which would have been way more noticeable than the smaller ones that probably several disappeared over time. So the patron of the work is usually identified as Bishop Odo, although others have suggested it was Queen Edith, the widow of King Edward. Either way, it was most certainly executed by a team of women that followed the designs of a single designer, either in a commercial workshop or by a whole convent. But it definitely required a massive group of embroiderers, right? We know women would have been the ones that did all the work for it, and it would have had to have been a large number of women working on this piece, because it would have taken, you couldn't have just a few women working on this. They wouldn't have finished. This required a massive amount of work and coordination to produce something this large, right? Embroidery is not something that is quick, especially with the level of detail and intricate embroidery that took place through all of it. It measures 230 feet long, 20 inches high. So like that, that's crazy in that sense. It depicts 58 scenes and 9 panels, and then it has borders, which you can see here, right? You've got a border up top and a border down here, that shows, and so the centerpiece is the whole kind of story of, the Battle of Hastings is a central part of it, but and the invasion as well. And then in the borders you have a variety of pieces. So the Battle of Hastings portrays key moments like William revealing his face, to keep the people, his soldiers going, and King Harold's death causing the English retreat and stuff like that. The borders on top and bottom have a wide range of fables, ornamentation. Sometimes what's going on underneath is matches like what's going on in the main story. Sometimes it's mythical creatures. You have like Halley's Comet in there, and one of the things that way. So the border images are much more varied and diverse in what's shown, whereas the centerpiece is the main story essentially of that. Occasionally the main story will like go up into the upper part of the border, but that's not consistent. And then as you can see here, they also would sometimes, not consistently, but sometimes name people, so you know who was who in those events. So here's a few other ones that you can see with the soldiers on horseback, coming over with the ships, preparing for war, it starts with. It begins with the panel of Edward the Confessor sending Harold to Normandy. And then Harold ends up in the wrong location in France and is taken prisoner until he's finally released to William, who invites him on a campaign against Conan II, that's the Duke of Brittany. On the way, the troops get stuck in quicksand, and then Harold saves 2 of the Norman soldiers. Later, it shows Harold becoming a knight, and then later being bequeathed the throne. It then shows the invasion of Normandy by King William. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October 14th, 1066. And then the whole piece highlights like several notable deaths. One, again, you see William reassuring his knights that he's alive by raising up his helmet in one scene. Then there's the part of the battle that shows like becoming super bloody with the troops being slaughtered and corpses on the ground. And that actually shows what's when that shows like all the death. The bottom pieces and the border actually show like dead soldiers and stuff. So again, sometimes the borders like match what's going on with the main story. Sometimes they're just they're decorative, it seems. And then finally in the end, King Harold is killed, and it shows the English troops fleeing the battle after his death. So again, this is one of the most impressive pieces of work that women were actively involved in, that is still around today. Another thing that develops after this is, and that became quite famous and popular, was the Opus Anglicanum. I always say this one wrong. Essentially, it's like English work. And that it was a period of like professional embroidery. This was what they became so like well known for their embroidery that everywhere in Europe would go to them to buy. And this isn't a specific people. It's just English embroidery. There were specific professional women embroiderers in England that had an international reputation, and their creations ended up being in great demand. And this led to more workshops and women in England embroidering, because England became for a while the height of skill of embroidery. And so much so that other parts of Europe would go to order and purchase things and commissions from them. And this allowed not just upper class women, but lower class women to earn an income through embroidery. and continue to develop those skills. So it was significant in terms of opening up to not just convents and noble women, but also being available to lower class women as a lucrative job that actually paid quite a bit of money and being seen as a professional job. Popes frequently ordered embroidered vestments from English workshops. Royalty, clerics, and wealthy patrons all over Europe wanted to own examples of the English embroidery. You, like I said, you had commissions from like Queen Isabella of Spain to decorate a vestment intended as a gift to the Pope. Like to be able to purchase and gift this English embroidery was seen as a social status. And again, that opened up the professional workshops and guilds that lower class women could be a part of and make good money doing, especially if you were talented in the skill of embroidery. And that's significant in the sense of it not just being, again, regulated to convents and wealthy women, because a lot of times artwork tended to be regulated to those two areas. So to have it be sought across Europe and to open up to others. So here's another example of the religious vestment done with English work. You can also see this one was a book binding cover that was done that's pretty intricate. And then you have some other pieces here that was done for a work that was not religious. So this is the secular work. And that's the other thing that it opened up to is, again, while we, with the increase in popularity in the English embroidery, while there was still, of course, more emphasis on religious functions, it opened up to a lot more secular creations being done as well, because people wanted it for their homes, they wanted it for gifts, they wanted it for everyday uses. Now, again, the smaller everyday uses don't survive long term for the most part. They did, like, you could have it on purses, you could have it on pillowcases, you could have it for like a furniture covering. It could be a small piece that you hung up for a small artwork. It really varied. The religious pieces never stopped either, but we do see a massive increase in secular work that's being created during this time as well. After 1250, the demand became so popular that in order to keep up with that, there was a shift from production of individuals and homes to organized commercial activity. Now, one of the things that happens with this is that, that I guess I suppose would be a negative of that, is that with the demand, it was already seen as professional work, but it was in these individual home workshops, which were largely all controlled and run by women. When the demand became so much that became shifted to a full-fledged commercial activity, more men end up taking over the art form. By the 13th century, you have what was considered essentially a master craftsman. They could be lots of things. So the title was master craftsman. And they could be like a goldsmith or working with textiles, any type of thing. But the idea was that even like a master craftsman could be a goldsmith who was considered perfectly competent to supply a design for an embroidered vestment. And the actual fabrication of the garment was still likely in the hands of women. But the problem is that when men start taking over like management of this, it decreased, like this management and supervision over female workers. It decreases women's control, value, and money that they were getting for this. So what ends up happening is that I don't want to say the wealth, the prestige, the independence that women got being when this first became popular in their these kind of home workshops, started to disappear as men took over running these commercial centers where they hired women, lower class women, to do the work, but paid them less. The women were no longer the ones getting the recognition. The other thing is that some of the quality of the work began to decline as they shifted towards mass production, which was directly linked to male involvement in the art form. So it ultimately, they became too popular, and that took away that control and power out of women's hands into their own. One of the most famous examples of this work is the Sion, which was a property of Brigittine nuns of the Sion convent located outside London. The cope is a complex composition of interlaced barbed quarterfoils, and then you have the borders are a later addition. So this border here was added after the fact with it. But the work illustrates scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin St. Michael slaying the dragon, the 12 apostles, seraphim, angels. 2 priests are part of it as well. Most of the robes of the holy figures inside it are sewn in gold thread. And then you have, of course, the green color. You have a background of like salmon panels and green for the background, right? The salmon here, the green background here, and then these figures are in that gold thread, right? So each one of these is that individual kind of panel that then was attached and sewn together. And then you had a wide range of colored silk threads that enhanced and gave like little accents to essentially the work. It's a good example of the delicacy and precision that the English embroidery period had, because while it may look more simplistic than let's say the Bayeux tapestry, the level of detail to create these figures, and again, I unfortunately may need one that like you could zoom in. If you're able to get like a closer picture and zoom in these the figures, they're really detailed. There is so much detail going in on those, and that amount of skill to do that and have it look very like high quality with not like kind of janky edges and things like that. That's super impressive. The other thing that emerged during this time, in part because of embroidery work, was an increase in urban working women and guilds in the textile arts as a whole, along with in other regions and areas. Essentially, right, this can kind of be connected to the context of women's work and labor in the later Middle Ages, and how these all kind of rose during this time and influenced women's roles in this type of labor. When work was organized in a family production unit, women had access to high status jobs, right? We saw that before the men took over and made it a commercial enterprise. This was then created high status jobs for women, and was beneficial to them. This is consistent with like the prominence of wives and widows of merchants, such as like Rose Burford, who came from a wool merchant family and continued running the business as a widow. This was common to wives and widows. So they would be part of a merchant family. They would work within the business. And then when their husband died, they continued the business on their own. The strong presence of women in Cologne's commercial world persisted as long as business and work were organized around these family units. And this is important because it meant that wives and daughters most often worked in the family's commercial enterprise. All of that was like the family business, right? When it moves to an individual that becomes a manager or supervisor, then hiring a bunch of people from all over, even if they're all women, into a workshop, the quality of work goes down, and the status and pay essentially goes down, right? The level of independence, the opportunities, the advantages that women had in these positions that are then highlighted in the artwork, and that because a lot of these jobs and these family businesses were connected to creating stuff, whether that was, food or artwork or the blacksmith and creating stuff that way. It was a lot of it was the act of creation, and in a sense, an art form in that self. Well, then they tended to have benefits during this period in doing so. And that in part was connected to the success and popularity of the embroidery that was very much centered around women's work within these units. Again, until it gets taken over and shifted to these workshops that are controlled by men. Because of the surplus of women and unmarried women who are forced to support themselves and work for wages, but wanted to run their own businesses, they had this, that what ends up happening is under English common law, unmarried women or widows got connected to what was the femme sole. So there's femme couvert and femme sole. Traditionally, when you're married, women were under femme couvert, and this meant that like all of their identity, their money, their politics, their everything was under the authority of their husband. In fact, under femme couvert, your identity became your husband's. So like a good example of this is like, and this lasted for a long time, like even into modern like U.S. period. For example, like when you used to get married, like it would be now introducing Mr. and Mrs. John Smith. That naming was intentional. It was very much connected to femme couvert. The idea being is when you got married, your name was, your identity was almost erased, right? You're Mrs. John Smith, right? None of that is the wife's name. And the idea is because once you get married, all of that identity gets shifted to the husband. So one of the problems with femme couvert, though, is that women like really didn't have control over business and work and stuff like that. So the fact that so much, because of embroidery, because of some of these other family unit businesses and stuff at the time, they shifted to femme sole, which was largely initially for widowed women who recognized that women had to survive. They then got their identity. They could own a business. They could keep their money. They could participate in all the activities that men could do. And this femme sole actually expanded during this time, in part, again, in large part because of the embroidery workshops and women's activity in there, that so much of that was done by women, not men. Even if men, when they take over, right, it was still women doing the embroidery, but prior to the men taking over, women were the ones that were running and doing all of this business. And then this expanded to, again, bread making. You can see here this silk industry with weaving and separating out silk. So this woman here is collecting the silk and then they're weaving it. And this is shown in the artwork too. So you have a huge period during this time where women in artwork and in actual work are shown in these positions, being the main people doing this. They shoemaking, tailoring, jewelry, bookbinding, again, all kind of arts. Areas of art and creation. The silk weaving and stuff was also an art form as well. These craft guilds then, and what this led to, and this is important with this, is it led to craft guilds that were women only, which is crazy because prior to this, women were not allowed in guilds. They were largely excluded, which limited women's ability to participate in artwork and some of that stuff. But there were women working at 108 occupations in Paris, and 5 of the 110 craft guilds that existed in Paris restricted membership to women only. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, 5 out of 110, right? 5 out of 110 were women only. But the fact that there were any women-only guilds, and that didn't count for that they did open up some guilds to women too, is amazing just in itself, because throughout history, one of the things that was clear in the Middle Ages that women were not allowed to be part of guilds. But because this was, women came to be so much part of that, and we see that in all this art that displays women's labor and work in these artistic areas that, again, originated from the growth of the embroidery. It opened up a lot of opportunities for women, at least for a period in time. Again, eventually that declines as men take over and make it more commercial enterprises. But all of this stuff until around the 14th century were female-dominated activities. And then around the 14th century, that got large, oh, look, you guys got a good thing going, and men found a way to take over and control things. But it was an impressive period where we see a lot of artwork highlighting like this of these female-dominated businesses that are within the arts field and in those different areas. All right, next we're going to look at women and Islamic art. All right, so since Islam prohibits the representation of human or animal form in religious contexts, a lot of Islamic art finds the main artwork and expression in calligraphy and design, where the Arabic script can be adapted and manipulated to create like beautiful styles and design. Unlike European illuminated manuscripts that have like elaborate artwork with people and scenes and stuff like that, the focus is on the text. The text itself is seen as an art form, kind of like Chinese calligraphy, which could be changed and adapted to fit the artistic style, along with using a lot of geometric and floral patterns and borders, or as the artwork itself. So here we have an example of this geometric pattern with gold that is the art itself, right? There's no people, there's no animals, there's no picture. The picture, the artwork is the design, and this becomes the emphasis. So Islamic illuminated manuscripts use all of the same, like when we talked about like how it was created, the different processes that were done, that all actually was the same, but the difference is just what the artwork was. The whole emphasis of Islamic illuminated manuscripts was within the text and making the text the art itself, and then, or you would have either mixed with these borders and designs, or you would have the borders and designs and the whole thing would be the artwork itself. So right in like European illuminated manuscript, these 2 pages would have been of people and scenes from the text. And in this case, with the Islamic illuminated manuscripts, it's the design, right? It's there as this visually pleasing artwork that doesn't have people. And obviously gold was just like in the European illuminated manuscripts, was used quite a bit to highlight, and this, I mean, here this gold's used a lot in this example, but it was often used as an accent, along with, of course, the different paints, the color paints, and the text itself. The text in manuscripts was not just written in black, but gold and other colors as well. Some text would be enclosed in color and designs. Other text was meant to stand alone. It could be different styles of script too. So a lot of times too, we saw in like the European manuscripts that the text was very similar style. That was consistent in a lot of the manuscripts. And here, almost every manuscript, the text was different. So let me go here so you can see. Here's an example of the script, where a lot of the script here is using gold, which was not done in the European manuscripts. And here you have one in red. And the text stands alone as the artwork. There are other ones where like they would have circles around it, and it would be fully colored in as a background, and then the text would be would stand out in the background and stuff like that. You have different sizes and shapes. You also have, here's another one of the geometric design as its own standalone artwork, not with the text. And then you also had a mix of ones where you'd have text and the design mixed together. And so this, well, manuscripts and stuff, this tended to be again, you had a lot of similarities, but then the differences was clearly in the artwork and style of artwork itself. We know that women were involved in the illustrations of the manuscripts, and we have a few that we know did some of the writing, the script itself. However, was common with the manuscripts, most of the women remained anonymous. We don't know specific women, and they, just like with the European manuscripts, the people that were creating them didn't put their name to the manuscript. So you don't know of individual people, but we know that there were some women that were involved in the calligraphy and illumination of these manuscripts, although in smaller numbers than in the European illuminated manuscripts. We also know that wealthy women would commission illuminated manuscripts for their own use and for their families. One of the things that was a key aspect where women could put their mark on the artwork, and almost like kind of again like the Chinese scrolls change the artwork to some degree, was in endowments. So endowments, the in-law endowing a manuscript made it forbidden to sell or barter or trade. And the practice was essentially meant to safeguard these expensive manuscripts for the mosque or a college for a private collection, right? The idea is that because these were so expensive, it protected them when the owner died, to make sure that they were preserved for the family forever. And this gave women a lot of control because women could commission these. They would have, or they could be endowed them, so they were given to them. And then once that happened, they could endow these to whoever they wanted. And with this endowment, so one, it gave women a lot of control on bequeathing these manuscripts to whoever they wanted. And they had full control over those decisions and deciding who they wanted them to go to. Endowing manuscripts was seen as a pious act, granting spiritual rewards, seen as a reflection of charity, as well as to be remembered. Since manuscripts were expected to outlast the individual who endowed them, they were often written with a strong awareness of the fact that you were going to die, and then this would eventually go on to someone else. So they often wrote in their endowments to be remembered, to have their wishes known, and to be seen kind of favorably. Women were active patrons and wrote many endowments in these illuminated manuscripts. And so they'd actually write in them, right? You can see here this edition. Those were often done in the endowments. You have other one here that's an example of this page. So oftentimes it could be done in the manuscript itself. Oftentimes endowments were written on the first couple of pages where there was not any text, or the back, in this case, in this example here, of the book where there wasn't any text. Occasionally they also added pages into it as well. And then occasionally you also saw endowments written in the text, in the book, in the manuscript itself as well. So this literally was an added part where there was consideration taken to the script when women were writing these and how they wanted it to be seen, the words that they wanted to be portrayed in that, and how they wanted that to be remembered. One manuscript that contained poetry in Persian and Turkish from over 20 different poets was endowed first to Fatima Hanum, and then she endowed it herself and dedicated it to her family's descendants and for the devotees of the Sufi order, which was revealed her concern to ensure that the Sufi would provide access to the anthologies of poetry. They often contain prayers or requests that the manuscripts be used. Fatima wrote that the endowment, so here's a quote, this was in her, let's see, I don't have a picture of this specific one, but this is a direct quote from an endowment. The endowment of the pilgrim Fatima from the descendants of the esteemed Rumi, may his sublime soul be sanctified for the progeny of her most felicitous grandfather, century after century. O Allah, accept it from her by your kindness, pardon her by your bounty, and forgive her by your mercy, O most merciful of the merciful, by the sanctity of the trustworthy intercessor. Amen. So, right, it was both like a prayer and a statement of who it was going to. Another manuscript was endowed by Rahima Hatun, the daughter of Yusuf, and her endowment statement stipulates that the manuscript be used to teach and preach within a newly established chair at a Friday mosque built in the 14th century. Another illuminated philosophy manuscript was gifted, which is this one here as the example. And it was they think that this one actually was she was likely the grandmother of the Safavid emperor, and she wrote in her statement that this manuscript was dedicated to students who lived in the area and others from others from the people of faith, with the condition that they do not take it outside of the city. The importance of this is that, like, even if women weren't directly making the illuminated manuscripts, they could be patrons of them. And more importantly, this endowment component allowed women to partake in the artwork by having adding their own kind of last statement to it, along with their wishes of what they wanted to be done with the manuscript. And this had to be followed. So this wasn't something that then someone would just say, oh, well, whatever, mom wrote this in the book, but whatever. It was a legal obligation to follow the endowment. It gave women power and control in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have, which was significant and something that was unique to kind of is the Islamic illuminated manuscripts. And also an opportunity for women to be part of the art that were not normally directly part of the art itself, because their writings and their words ended up being physically added to the manuscripts. And again, like I said, they often were conscious of what they're writing becoming a part of this book. And so choosing the color of ink that they would use for their writings, the style of script they wanted to use. Like, these things were taken into account, along with, of course, what they wanted to say, how they wanted to say it, and what they wanted to have happen with the manuscripts themselves. And then lastly, and I'll try to I know it's getting long again, always, every single time. I do, that should just be the standard. It's going to be long, but I'll try to get through this last stuff here, so don't go too long into this. With other representations of women in Islamic art, you do have figural themes and representation in some Islamic art. It's just not as common, especially when you had like outside groups that came in and took over and controlled the Islamic empire that were initially seen as outsiders, that had other traditions and customs and expectations. The rule on showing people was less strict outside of specific religious figures. Of course, like, there were still religious restrictions on Muhammad and his family and that type of thing. But just in showing like royalty or people, again, because the belief was that an emphasis on figure art would lead to false idols, potentially. And so the best way to avoid false idols was to not have figure art. However, when you do have these other forces come in and control the Islamic empires, then you do have mural paintings and sculptures and secular architecture that celebrated various things like sporting activities, courtly scenes, female beauty, portraits of court poets, and excerpts of their poems were painted on walls. There was arts and ceramics, metalwork, woodwork, and glass that were all displayed. There were also scenes of royal games, dancers, musicians, and literary themes. Now, even these weren't, again, this was not massively common, but you do have these that women were then portrayed. A lot of times in these court scenes and things like that, women were portrayed in kind of as background to whatever the main scene was, being shown as musicians or dancers, right? That they were supporting roles in the scene of itself. However, there were some examples of artwork where women were more central and shown to be kind of the main scene. These largely focused on aristocratic women. and highlighted again, because again, artists, women in the Islamic world were not as commonly out in public society all the time, and had very strict rules and regulations on clothing. So, as being seen and depicted, there were limitations to daily life and experiences with the role of women outside of the individual's family. Um, but aristocratic women were more likely to be present, or commission artwork, or be part of a scene where they were seen in small amounts or ways. With this, there's a couple common ways that aristocratic women were often shown in this type of art. One was it being carried in a litter. And this is usually like a compartment that was covered with a dome and placed on the back of a camel, although sometimes it was an elephant, but the camel was the most common. And then it was covered and it had decorated cloth that was almost exclusively used for women. And so you see some of these scenes, and there was one that was a painted plate that showed this litter with the curtains. It had like a triangle top decorated with a crescent on top, and only the face of a woman inside it is seen. So she has so you can see a slight part of her veil and then her face. Everything else is restricted, which would have actually been a common way that people saw women traveling. The litter was a way to conceal women from the public, and so quick glimpses, or that would be if they peeked out of the curtain. And this only would have been for wealthy nobility that would have traveled in this way. The Blakas Ur, which is this Ur here, is a brass Ur inlaid with silver and copper. And there's all these scenes that are depicted on the Ur. And there's actually several of women, showing women in that. And one of the scenes shows a woman in a litter. Again, mostly just her face, which was, again, face and veil that were very common. And of course, almost all depictions of women, especially if they were married women or women of the aristocratic families rather than like slaves and servants, were shown veiled, as that was seen as proper clothing, also with long dress that covered their body. Here, the next scene besides, so again, women being shown transported in litters. The next was women with mirrors being held up. So here in the same Ur, we see an example of an aristocratic woman. She has wearing the veil, long sleeves, full covered clothing, and she has an attendant that's holding up a mirror for her to look in. This often was connected to beauty and status, being attended by servants with luxury items and the ability to do that. Always, again, this is where we see women more fully, right? This tended to be not either inside the litter or somewhere else, so that it's not just the face or part of the body that's shown. You actually get to see the full woman, where they're wearing like a dress, almost always with long wide sleeves, that have decorations, elaborate decorations, and that are fully covering with a veil or turban on their head. And then they have servants that are providing for them. And again, looking in the mirror. There was another one that showcased a woman sitting cross-legged, holding a mirror in her hand, where she had two other attendants. One has a toilet or jewelry box that's holding out, and another's holding a fly whisk. And then there's like peacocks on the top and bottom of this. In all these cases, you always have a woman with a mirror, is not by herself, but there's various number of attendants that are there with her, which again is to reemphasize the wealth of these aristocratic women, right? They're highlighted and shown to be the luxury and leisure that these women had is highlighted in this artwork. The other style is, so that you have, the second was the reclining in mirrors. The third style was reclining in leisure. There was a common scene of women reclining on a couch, usually in like outdoor surroundings, and then having attendants with them. The oldest one is from the Cleveland Ur, that shows a figure reclining on a couch with her right arm bent behind her head and the left arm bent in front of her body. And then there's a attendant seated on one side of her holding a beaker. And then another person at the rear holding a long neck bottle. and then you have like birds and trees surrounding her. And in all these cases, again, the whole idea is that there's always attendants with a bunch of stuff attending to whatever their needs are. Or you hear in this example here of the painting, you see women with a highlighting of the clothing that's fully covering and the veils and coverings of women. So it always was about modesty and proper dress and not being too shown in public. And at the same time, within these examples of these aristocratic women that were shown during this early Middle Age period in Islamic art, it was also meant to highlight when they were the center of artwork, the scenes of luxury and leisure, right? You maintain proper decorum in dress and coverage, but also highlighted the luxury and leisure that they had. It gave a view of how wealthy women traveled, how they were attended by servants, and the type of leisure and luxury that was acceptable to be displayed in public, right? These women were part of a luxurious courtly life. And while they weren't always the main focal point and not always seen in public, it still gives a brief glimpse into the kind of elaborate, wealthy life that women had out of the public's view in this period. Clearly with all the attendants, with all the people that were providing for them, it almost looks like, and again, always kind of seen in scenes where they're being carried, they're sitting down, they're lounging in a couch, right? That it's almost like everything is provided to me, which highlights this idea of women being treated in luxury. Of course, this doesn't account for lower class women in their lives, but it does highlight some of women's roles in the upper aristocratic class, and how they were attended to and provided for, but in an almost closed and protected way from general public involvement, right? They weren't outside and actively involved in the public and the what was going on in day-to-day scenes in the town. Instead, we're kind of kept protected and removed from that. And this highlights and showcases that kind of luxury, but protection at the same time. All right, that's where we're going to end for this lecture. And yes, that's it for today.